Alfonso Cahero, A Journey into Finance History. Chapter 46, OPEC Oil Embargo and Energy Crisis, 1973. In the early 1970s, the world was buzzing with energy. Literally. Oil was the lifeline of economies, fueling industries, transportation, and even households. The Middle East was at the center of it all, sitting on vast reservoirs of oil that powered the global engine of progress. But beneath the surface of this apparent stability, tensions simmered. The world had become heavily reliant on oil, and its demand seemed insatiable. Nations raced to secure their oil supplies, forging alliances and making deals to ensure their energy needs were met. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, emerged as a formidable entity, comprising oil-rich nations determined to assert their influence over the global oil market. Yet, despite the growing importance of oil, few foresaw the storm that was brewing on the horizon. The stage was set for a crisis of unprecedented proportions, one that would shake the foundations of the global economy and reshape the geopolitical landscape forever. Oil wasn't just a commodity, it was power. It fueled not only cars and factories, but also ambitions and conflicts. Nations coveted oil reserves like treasure, knowing that control over this black gold equated to control over the modern world. The Middle East, with its vast oil wealth, became the focal point of global attention. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq held the keys to the world's energy future. They formed the core of OPEC, a coalition of oil-producing nations determined to assert their influence on oil prices and production levels. With OPEC's formation in 1960, the balance of power in the oil market began to shift, giving rise to a new era of energy geopolitics. For decades, the Western world had enjoyed relatively stable access to cheap oil, largely controlled by multinational corporations. But as OPEC flexed its muscles, demanding greater control over oil prices and production, tensions between oil-producing nations and the West began to escalate. As the 1970s dawned, tensions in the Middle East reached a boiling point. The Arab-Israeli conflict simmered, fueled by decades of resentment and territorial disputes. Arab nations, outraged by Western support for Israel, began to wield oil as a weapon, threatening to cut off supplies to countries deemed sympathetic to Israel's cause. In 1973, the situation reached a tipping point. In response to the Yom Kippur War, Arab members of OPEC imposed an oil embargo on the United States and other Western nations, sparking a crisis of unprecedented proportions. Overnight, oil prices skyrocketed, and long lines formed at gas stations as fuel shortages gripped the nation. The world watched in disbelief as the once stable oil market descended into chaos. The era of cheap oil was over, replaced by a new reality of scarcity and uncertainty. For the first time in modern history, the power of oil-producing nations was laid bare for all to see as they wielded their control over the world's most precious resource as a political weapon. The impact of the OPEC oil embargo rippled across the globe, sending shockwaves through the economies of both oil-producing and oil-consuming nations alike. In the United States, the effects were particularly severe as the nation grappled with soaring inflation, rising unemployment, and stagnant economic growth. Gasoline prices soared, and everyday Americans felt the pinch as the cost of living skyrocketed. Industries reliant on cheap oil struggled to stay afloat, while consumers faced the harsh reality of rationing and energy conservation measures. The American way of life, built on a foundation of cheap and abundant energy, was suddenly under threat. But the effects of the oil crisis were not confined to the United States alone. Countries around the world felt the squeeze as oil prices surged to unprecedented levels. Europe, heavily reliant on imported oil, faced a similar crisis, while developing nations in Africa and Asia saw their fragile economies pushed to the brink of collapse. As the crisis deepened, governments scrambled to find solutions, implementing emergency measures and seeking alternative sources of energy. But the road ahead was fraught with uncertainty, as the world grappled with the harsh realities of a new energy landscape. The OPEC oil embargo of 1973 marked a turning point in global history, reshaping the geopolitical landscape and forever altering the dynamics of the global economy. Overnight, the balance of power shifted as oil-producing nations asserted their dominance, and the West grappled with the harsh realities of a new energy reality. Gone were the days of cheap and abundant oil, replaced by a new era of scarcity and uncertainty. The world was forced to confront the finite nature of its most precious resource, as nations scrambled to secure their energy futures and reduce their dependence on foreign oil. In the years that followed, the legacy of the oil crisis loomed large, casting a long shadow over global affairs. The rise of renewable energy sources and the push for energy independence became key priorities for nations around the world, as they sought to avoid the pitfalls of relying too heavily on fossil fuels. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the oil crisis was its impact on the geopolitical landscape. The once dominant Western powers found themselves at the mercy of oil-producing nations, forced to navigate a new world order in which energy security was paramount. As the dust began to settle in the wake of the oil crisis, nations around the world embarked on a journey of recovery and renewal. In the United States, President Jimmy Carter made energy independence a top priority, calling on Americans to embrace conservation and invest in alternative energy sources. The era of big cars and even bigger energy consumption was over, replaced by a newfound emphasis on efficiency and sustainability. From solar power to wind energy, the push for renewable energy sources gained momentum as nations sought to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels and mitigate the risks of future energy crises. But the road to recovery was far from easy. The scars of the oil crisis ran deep, leaving lasting economic and social impacts in its wake. Inflation remained stubbornly high, unemployment soared, and the specter of energy insecurity loomed large over the global economy. Yet, amid the challenges, there were signs of hope. The oil crisis had forced nations to confront the realities of their energy consumption habits and spurred a renewed commitment to innovation and adaptation. From energy-efficient technologies to sustainable urban planning, the seeds of a greener, more resilient future were sown in the ashes of the crisis. As the world emerged from the shadow of the oil crisis, it was clear that the events of 1973 had left an indelible mark on the global consciousness. The era of cheap and abundant oil was over, replaced by a new reality of scarcity and uncertainty. But amid the challenges, there were valuable lessons to be learned. The oil crisis had exposed the vulnerabilities of an energy system built on fossil fuels, highlighting the need for greater diversification and resilience in the face of future shocks. Nations around the world began to invest in alternative energy sources and implement energy conservation measures, recognizing the importance of reducing their dependence on foreign oil. From solar and wind power to nuclear energy and biofuels, the push for innovation and sustainability gained momentum as nations sought to build a more resilient and secure energy future. But perhaps the most important lesson of all was the need for cooperation and collaboration on a global scale. The events of 1973 had shown that energy security was not a zero-sum game, but rather a shared challenge that required collective action and mutual understanding. As the years passed, the legacy of the oil crisis continued to shape the course of global history. The push for renewable energy sources gained momentum as nations sought to reduce their dependence on fossil fuels and mitigate the risks of future energy crises. But the impact of the oil crisis extended far beyond the realm of energy policy. It had fundamentally altered the geopolitical landscape, reshaping the balance of power and redefining the relationships between nations. The once dominant Western powers found themselves at the mercy of oil-producing nations, forced to navigate a new world order in which energy security was paramount. The rise of OPEC and the growing influence of oil-producing nations challenged the traditional dominance of Western powers, ushering in a new era of multipolar diplomacy and cooperation. But amid the challenges, there were also opportunities. The oil crisis had spurred a wave of innovation and adaptation, driving technological advancements and reshaping the global economy. From energy-efficient technologies to sustainable urban planning, the crisis had sparked a newfound emphasis on innovation and resilience.